Welcome to the 10th episode of the season 2 of Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, ASHA, and Ganga Jamni online series. Today, we are once again going to talk and listen to an author who has helped add to our knowledge of the past. She is a scholar of modern period in Indian history who has worked extensively on the city of Delhi. Let us welcome Dr. Swapna Liddle. She is an independent scholar who wrote her PhD on cultural and intellectual change in Delhi under the rule of East India Company, and since then has extended her study to the development of Delhi as an imperial capital city, particularly under Mughal and British rule. For many years, she has also been closely involved in the movement to preserve historic sites and monuments. She had originally conducted most of her research on the city while she had been working on the UNESCO project to have Delhi and Shahjahanabad given the status of a World Heritage City. Her publications include Chandni Chowk, The Mughal City of Old Delhi, which was published in 2017, Connaught Place and the Making of New Delhi, published the next year in 2018, and Mapping a Mughal City, Shahjahanabad 1846 to 47, which is her forthcoming work. She has also edited and annotated a translation of Sairul Manazil of Mirza Sangeen Beg, and this annotation was done in 2018. As all of you know, Sangeen Beg is an early 19th century text on the neighborhoods and monuments of Delhi. Today, we have her to discuss 19th century Shah Jahanabad, the evolution of the Mughal city. Welcome, Dr. Liddle. Let us hear you out.
Thank you so much, Professor Rezavi, for this wonderful introduction. I am very grateful to the Aligarh Society for History and Archaeology and to Ganga Jamuni and for this invitation to speak at this very eminent series, which has included so many authors, so many scholars. And I look forward to sharing some of my thoughts on this topic of the evolution of Shahjahanabad, particularly through some of the sources which are there in the 19th century. Before I start, I would like to mention one thing which I was just talking to Professor Rezavi about, which is that I hope the material that I'm presenting today is a very it's tentative, some tentative conclusions that I have come to after looking at some of these sources, which I will be talking about. I really hope that some of our history students who might watch this talk at some point might want to take up something like this as a history subject. There is a lot of scope in this to look at sources which are further back and to do a proper study of Shahjahanabad. And I really hope that that is going to be possible. So, without any further ado, let me talk about Shahjahanabad. I won't go very much into the history. Many of you will know, but I will just sum it up. Shahjahanabad was founded by the Emperor Shah Jahan, after whom it is named, at the high point of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire at that point was not only wide in its extent, it was prosperous, it was flourishing, um, and really it was, as in the West, they started calling the Mughal emperor the Great Mughal, and it was really. It was as if nothing further needed to be done, and Shah Jahan's own inclination, of course, was as a great builder, and his magnum opus, which is the Taj Mahal, was also under construction in Agra. And he then decides to found a new capital. And a large part of that impulse is that of the ultimate achievement for a great builder is to found a city. The ultimate achievement for a emperor who has building at his heart is to build a great city. And that's what he proceeds to do. And the if you read some of the accounts, at least of the court historians, others, it seems that a lot of the focus initially really was on the fort itself. So it's the Red Fort, what we call the Red Fort now, of course, but that's the main citadel of the city, that gets the main attention of the Imperial Works Department. So from 1639, when the foundations are laid, to 1648, when the fort is formally inaugurated, all the energies of the imperial departments of works are focused on the Red Fort. We have a lot of evidence of that. I'm not going to talk about the Red Fort so much today. Then I'm sure at the same time, some of the outlines of the city would have come up. Some main streets would have been planned. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just share my a few images that I have, so that you can see some. It's always interesting to have a few slides, I think. So if we can have that, you have, this is the fort overlooking the river. And this is a 19th century painting. Most of the paintings, etc., we have are of the 19th century, when the company, East India Company, comes to Delhi and starts commissioning a lot of paintings. So many of them are from that period. This is from, again, from the same period. So you have the Red Fort, which is uh, overlooking the river, but beyond that, which you can't see from this view, is the city. Now, in the city, what we have is the streets. Very important part is played by, say, the ceremonial avenues. The Mughal emperor, of course, there is a lot of grandeur associated with the ceremonial surrounding the emperor. So, the ceremonial avenue is a very important part of that. So, the ceremonial avenue is there. We have streets. So, as I said, that the fort, while the fort is being built, what is also happening is that you have the, I'm sure the basic structure would have been planned out. It is likely that these main three streets, whenever you read histories of Shahjahanabad, whether it is Sangin Beg or it is Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who writes his book in 1847, you have a certain, the description always is the fort is there, the walls are there, three big bazaar streets are there, one going north south, that is Faiz Bazaar, one going east west, which is in different sections has different names. The part which is closest to the fort is called the Urdu Bazaar. So on and so forth. One very important road, which is a street which is called Khas Bazaar, is from the fort to the Jama Masjid. This basically is the plan. So the extent of it, the main streets were probably laid down while this construction of the Red Fort is going on. Also at the same time, there are the big nobles who now know that this new city is coming up, and as the citadel gets uh, constructed, there are no doubt they are also making their homes. So For instance, Dara Shikoh builds a big mansion. Ali Mardan Khan's mansion also comes up uh, in due course. So these are people who are moving slowly to Delhi and building their homes as well in the new city. Uh, the mosque, which is always mentioned, the Jama Masjid, which in many models seems like the complement to the fort. Like, I will talk about the Islamic city concept, which is very popular and is being used to describe Shahjahanabad. They often talk about the fort, the bazaar, the congregational mosque. The masjid actually does not even begin to be, it does, is not built until the fort itself gets done. It's after the fort gets done that the mosque is built. The city walls are also built after the fort is done. So the priority actually is the citadel. The priority is the citadel, other things come up later. You have, while these, so this is, sorry, this is the mosque, the Jama Masjid, in again a late 18th century drawing by Thomas Daniel. And then this is a modern photograph of the Digambar Jain Lal Mandir. The reason why I'm showing you this is that while we talk about the mosque, we also need to talk about the temple, because this, in fact, is the tall shikhars are a new addition, but the older parts you can see with there's a red and white striped dome. There's that vaulted dome, which the white marble. These are the older parts of it. This is part of Dariba, the uh, the eastern edge of Dariba. Now, Dariba is the reason I'm mentioning Dariba is apart from all the nobility, the royal family who are building things, and what happens is that the kind of things the royal family builds, they are the mosques. There are some mosques that are built. Akbar Abadi Begum, one of the wives of Shah Jahan, builds Akbar Abadi Masjid, which is also called the Kashmiri Katreki Masjid, which comes up around this time. Then there is Fatehpuri Begum, another wife of Shah Jahan, who builds Fatehpuri Masjid. There are the daughters of Shah Jahan are responsible for some of the constructions. Roshanara Begum lays out a garden which is north of the city called Roshanara Bagh. Jahanara, who was a wealthy woman and a wealthy woman with a lot of good taste, she also does some amount of entrepreneurial, and these were on, the Mughal women used to invest their money in sound business ventures as well. And what she does is she builds a bazaar. She builds a bazaar laid out in a chalk, around a chalk, and that's the Chandni Chalk. She builds the Chandni Chowk Bazaar. She builds a sarai, which in later times is called Sarai Chandni Mahal. We see it in some of the maps, but or Sarai Begum Ka Bagh. So this sarai is built. There's a large garden adjoining the sarai. So these kind of things are being made by various members of the royal family. There are members of the nobility who are also not only building their own mansions, but no doubt, as was often the case, are investing in commercial spaces as well. They would often, there used to be katras, etc., which were bazaars and katras, which were founded by the nobility. So all this construction work is going on simultaneously. One category of person that is very important for the new city are the merchants and traders, the bankers, because these are no successful city, no successful capital, no successful empire can after all run without its bankers. And to have the bankers are the Jain merchants. And there is in the Jain histories, if you look at the Jain histories, they will tell you that there was one Deep Chand Shah from Hisar, who was invited by Shah Jahan to come and set up his business in Delhi. And Dariba, it was in Dariba that he and his 16 sons set up their businesses over here. So that is the origin of Dariba. So a very prominent part in the city, uh, the Jain merchants set up their uh, business in, and the temple is part of that whole uh, business enterprise of the Jain merchants that comes up. Now, going further, if you look at what happens to this city, I will be talking about the structure of the city a little later, but I'm just now just summing up the development of the city. As I said, first the fort comes up, the citadel. Around that, the city comes up. People are building their houses. We hear about the big nobility building houses. We can assume that there are other people building also. So, all the people who are, who are going to be living in the city, who begin to live in the city, once the project on the fort starts, there's already become a populous, it is becoming a populous city because a lot of people who are connected with that project are coming and staying there. So the city starts to take shape as it goes along. What I am trying to say also is that it is not necessary that everything is dictated by the imperial central authority, that this is how it will be laid out, this is how the streets will be laid out, apart from the main street. Main streets, yes, those contours are given by imperial planning, but a lot of the how people, where people will build their houses, what, how they will build them, what are the where people will settle, etc. There is a lot of leeway in that. As I will, as we go on, I will show some of that. So what happens in the 18th century, once, I mean, Shah Jahan is succeeded by Aurangzeb, and Shah Jahan doesn't stay very much in Shahjahanabad, because he is then goes into exile in Agra once Aurangzeb is on the throne. And Aurangzeb also actually spends a lot of his reign in the Deccan. So therefore, that does not mean that Shahjahanabad is by any means abandoned or even neglected, because there are a lot of activities that are happening there. It is a cultural hub. It's a business and trading hub. So all that still goes on. So it has a cultural life. It has a business life. It is a thriving urban center, as it was even before, but it is now much more. I mean, Shahjahanabad continues to be like that. 18th century, come the 18th century, there are, of course, we as historians know that the earlier stereotype of 18th century being a period of unmitigated decline is not accepted anymore. We understand that it's a very, very complex uh, process, what is happening to urban centers, etc. Even big urban centers and the capital like Delhi, though it goes through its periods of political crisis, invasions, civil war, etc. But it is definitely not unmitigated decline. There is a rich cultural life that happens. There are periods of extended peace, and the cultural vitality, say, of Muhammad Shah's reign in the first half of the 18th century. There is a lot of it's a thriving city. It continues to be a thriving city in the 18th century. However, what happens is that because some of the nobility, because of the civil war and whatever that's going on, and this is in fact a normal part of any politics, that individual fortunes rise and fall. So there is somebody who's a very powerful noble at this point, and a few years down the line or a few decades down the line, not only has his political power declined, but the family has lost its fortune, etc. And the impact of that on the city can be seen. And the impact is that a lot of these big mansions that were there are then subdivided among new occupants, or partly old occupants, some new occupants, etc. Some of them become full-fledged mohallas. One example I will give is Haveli Haider Kuli. Haveli Haider Kuli is still a mohalla in Shahjahanabad. Haider Kuli was a noble of the reign of Muhammad Shah, so in the first half of the 18th century. And the by the time you come to the early 19th century and Sangin Beg is writing his Sairul Manazil, Haveli Haider Kuli really has become a mohalla. It has become a mohalla, and he says among the people who are living there are some coachmen. So, so this kind of change was happening. There is subdivision that is going on of the havelis, that of the large mansions, of the big estates. Not even one haveli, it's like a big compound with a lot of structures in them. So that kind of change is happening throughout the 18th century. And by the time you come to the early 19th century, which this image on your screen now shows, you have a city that is quite complex. The population within the walls is about 1.5 lakhs by the middle of the 19th century. And a lot of construction has happened, even extending. So this is actually what this print shows is the area from, if you are looking from Red Fort to the Jama Masjid, the area in between that you can see a lot of houses, you can see trees, etc. So a lot has come up in the intervening space. What used to be called Chowk Sadullah Khan is now, a lot of it is taken up with a lot of construction that has happened around that area. So now I am going to be talking really about a couple of sources that we have, which I have looked at for this period in Delhi's history. One of them is this map of Shahjahanabad. This map dates from, it's in the British Library, it dates from uh, about 1846-47, which is based on internal evidence in the map. And it is, it's a very, it has been reprinted before, it has also been redrawn and published in a book, which was an edited volume by Eckhart Ehlers and Thomas Kraft. And it was also published by in a big format, as is by in a book edited by J.P. Losty. So it has been published before, and really this map, it's a huge map. It's like a 1 meter by 1 meter. So you can imagine the kind of detail that we have here. I will show some of that detail. But before I go into any of that, I would like to talk about some of the background of how some scholars have seen Shah Jahanabad. What is Shah Jahanabad? What does it tell us about a typical Mughal city, if there is a typical Mughal city or not, as the case may be? If there is a typical city, Shah Jahanabad would really exemplify it. But let us see what is said. Now, one author, scholar who has talked about this is Stephen Blake. And Stephen Blake um, came up with this idea of a sovereign city. It's a sovereign city, it's the capital of a patrimonial bureaucratic empire, which supposedly the Mughal Empire was. And the idea being that this is an empire where all the power flows from the emperor, and everybody below them kind of is organized in that kind of structure of power. Uh, he sees the city as a microcosm of this kind of empire. It's this empire on a smaller scale is the city. So, in that, he sees the Red Fort as a sort of a pivot of the city. The city is around it, and all the elite, their mansions are like mimicking the Red Fort. They are like, again, microcosms of the Red Fort. And and they are the central institutions of Shah Jahan. Now, that is a big statement that he makes, because his main thing is that it is the elite mansions which are the central institutions of Shah Jahan. What does that mean? Each mansion, so Haveli Haider Kuli, take one example, or any other Haveli of a noble. Within it, it has a large compound. Within it has many structures and a large population within it, because it has all the people who are associated with the mansion, whether it is the retainers, the soldiers, the karkhanas which are producing goods for the use of the extended household. All these are housed within that elite, in the noble's mansion. And this, uh, Blake calls the elite mohalla. Now, he acknowledges that it is not just elite mohallas. There are other, though he calls them the central institutions of Shahjahanabad, but there are other kinds of mohallas also. And these are basically caste or craft mohallas. And basically, what he says is that and he says that the mohalla is the major form of residential organization, and it is occupied by people of the same caste, craft, profession, or tribe, surrounded by high walls and containing shops and stalls, wells and tanks, and rest houses for travelers. So that is the how he describes a mohalla. And he claims that these are there in Shahjahanabad. You can see these kind of mohallas with these high walls, etc. Including within them people all of one craft or one caste or profession, whatever. So that is Blake's uh, hypothesis. Then you have Eckhart Ehlers and Thomas Kraft, who again redrew this map and based their study to a large extent on this map itself. They also see the importance of the mohalla, and they call it, the mohallas are, and I quote this, sealed homogeneous units within the city. Sealed homogeneous units. They are again suggesting what Blake said about the high walls and gates which are sealing off the mohalla from the rest of the city, and they are housing within them, uh, you know, uh, people who are again homogeneous, socially homogeneous, culturally homogeneous. Then, and they also bring in this notion of Shahjahanabad as an Islamic city. I will not go into the whole idea of what an Islamic city is supposed to be, but it is quite, I mean, things like differentiated bazaars, the citadel, the mosque, which are actually quite nebulous ideas. I mean, a lot of cities would have equivalents. I mean, without necessarily becoming Islamic in that sense. Also, he looks at the mohalla as embodying the values of the Sharia. And what are these values? The distinction between private space, which is the home, the semi public space, which is the mohalla, inside of the mohalla, outside the home, and then there's the outer city, which is the public space. Now, that distinction between private, semi private, semi public, and public is, if it embodies the values of the Sharia, I don't know, but I would imagine that this is something which surely has a wider application rather than just uh, characteristic of an Islamic city. This is, these distinctions are uh, not all that distinctive, I would say. There is uh, another, in the same volume of essays, is an essay by Jamal Malik, who also looks at the same map. And in this, he sees an unequivocal structure of these feudal lords and social groups who hierarchically settled around the palace according to their respective social status. So now, again, he sees them as socially cohesive units, these mohallas. that mostly bear the denomination of the dominant service sectors settled over here: artisans, traders, ethnic groups, or other representatives of economic and social life. Now, and then he sees that, you have he brings out these models of a mohalla which has its mohalla mosque or a profession mosque which is at its center, and then the rest of the mohalla around it. uh, Before I go, I must leave this as topic of the different models that have been developed. I must mention Shama Mitra Chinoy, because Shama Mitra Chinoy really does not agree with a lot of this. And one of the things which Shama Mitra Chinoy does, which these other authors have not looked at, is the Serul Manazil. Because when you look at the Serul Manazil, you see the complexity of the city. With just looking at a map or a few court, uh, you know, records or court accounts of the founding of Shahjahanabad will not reveal to you, because Sarah Manazil is a very detailed description, and she looks at the complexity, and she really urges us to look at the fact that Shahjahanabad evolved. It was an evolving city, and even in the first place, this was a city with a lot of heterogeneity, lot of people living next to each other, not the kind of hierarchies, that rigid hierarchies which many of these models suggest. When you start looking at the sources, and particularly when you start looking at as texts like the Serun Manazil, you will realize that these just don't hold true. But what I'm going to do is I am going to look at show you a few of these images to give you an idea of what really the map is about, and how that correlates with what Sangeen Beg tells us also. So this is, for instance, one part of the map. Now, the map is very interesting. It shows in those different colored patches. I mean, sorry, let me go back to this for a moment. You see these different colored areas. These are all Thana limits. There were 12 Thanas in Shahjahanabad. So these are all differently colored Thana bound limits. So these are Thana jurisdictions. They are all very, very clearly marked, not only with the color, but there's a red line which marks the boundaries of each Thana. And I'm going to kind of zoom into just one of these thanas, which is Dariba. And you'll have to forgive the kind of annotation I've done. This is very rough and ready annotation. I was doing a bit of study on this. So therefore, I started putting down some of these, but you don't have to bother about it. Also, please forgive me, north is at the bottom. So this is just something that I did because it was convenient at that time. This is Dariba. Now you can make out where it is. I've chosen Dariba because a lot of people are also familiar with Dariba, even though you may not be very familiar with other parts of Shahjahanabad. If you live in Delhi, if you visited Delhi, you go to Shahjahanabad, you'll see this. Now, Dariba, it's very interesting to me that when uh, Sankim Beg starts to describe the city, how he really talks of Dariba, because he doesn't see Dariba as one whole. Even though, as I said, in its founding, you can say that uh, the even the Jain histories say that it was founded by a number of Jains who had come from Hisar. There was one big, large family of Jains, and there were other Jains also who settled down in Dariba in a while. So, if you are looking at homogeneous groups, then this would be a homogeneous group par excellence, but it's not. And Sankin Beg, interestingly, he approaches this from different sides. He does not talk about Dariba all at once. He talks that within his text, it is divided into actually three different sections, because he talks about it when he's talking about the bazaar, Chowdi Bazaar, which is at the west of Jama Masjid. He deals with that part of Dariba in a different place. Then when he starts talking about the area north of Jama Masjid, then he talks about another section of Dariba. Then when he starts talking about the the bazaar, the Urdu bazaar in front of the Red Fort, he talks about uh, this section of Dariba. So in his own mind, Sangin Beg is not looking at Dariba as a whole. He is not looking at it from the point of view of one homogeneous space. Okay, we can of course assume that Dariba being a thana and not a mohalla, but though of course it is also mentioned as a mohalla in some of the sources, which I'll come to later. Uh, it is not homogeneous. We know it can it I can give you some straightforward examples. For instance, one of the things, it's not only the Jains who live there. There is Badruddin Muharkon, a very famous seal maker. Badruddin's Haveli is here. Then another Haveli is that of a very prominent Portuguese family, the De Eremau family. So Manuel de Eremau's uh, Haveli Manuel Sahab, which is there towards the west of in this Thana limit. So so what I'm trying to say is that Sangin Beg is not looking at Dariba as a whole. How does he actually perceive the city? If Sangin Beg is writing this description of the city, he is trying to describe a city. And when you start to describe a city, how do you do it? If I mean, I would presume that I would look at a city through its neighborhoods. How is he looking at it? If you look at his organizing principle is very, very different. He does not look at it through the neighborhoods, really not. His organizing principle is goes on these long walks down the streets. So what he is doing is he starts from the Red Fort, for instance, and this first section that he deals with is the Khas Bazaar, the road that goes from the Red Fort to the Jama Masjid. You can see it in blue in this particular map. So he first covers this stretch and he talks of what is on the left and what is on the right. Then he goes a little further from the Jama Masjid to Qazi Ka Hauz. And Qazi Ka Hauz, he again does this. He is talking about what is on the left, what is on the right. From there, he goes to Ajmeri Gate. Again, he is talking about what is all the things that are on the right and what all the things that are on the left. From there, then he goes towards Khari Bauli. So he is not taking chunks of the city as a sort of an aerial view, as an organizing chunks or mohallas. He is going down streets. He is going down streets and looking at what is on the left, what is on the right. And then, of course, he goes to Turkman Gate, again from this node. So what he does is he does that, then he comes back to the Jama Masjid and starts going down Chitli Kabar. So on and so forth. You get the idea. This is how he is really organizing the city in his own mind, how he is structuring his exploration of the city. Now I come to one aspect that to me was quite, this was something that I really, really was curious about. This question of mohalla. I really wanted to know कि ये मोहल्ले हैं, किस टाइप के मोहल्ले हैं? Who are the people who are? What are these caste and craft groups which are inhabiting Shahjahanabad? And I this it surprised me that Sangin Beg actually mentions only 14 mohallas. Only 14 locations does he actually mention as mohalla. Everything else he mentions bazaar, and by bazaar, every lot of the streets are bazaar streets. Huh? So Urdu bazaar hai, Khas bazaar hai, Chowdi bazaar hai, many streets like this. He Lal Kuan bazaar hai. So the main streets are all bazaar streets. Most of them are commercial. He calls them bazaars. So again, displaying his orientation towards streets, he uses the street designation much more than he uses mohallas. Only 14 mohallas are mentioned by him in such a large space. 12 to tha nahi hai. So mohalle kitne honge? So, however, let me come to the subject matter of this particular slide, which is the mohallas which are mentioned by a source which comes in the beginning of the 20th century. This is the ASI listing of historically important buildings in Shahjahanabad. And the author of that is Maulvi Zafar Hasan. though the editing is done by J.A. Page. So a lot of the organizational principles of that work would have been the work of J.A. Page. He would have said, "Kis tarah se isko organize karo," and what the result of this organization is that all of the city is organized according to mohallas. So what happens now? I tried to correlate this. I tried to see. Now, if you look at the mohallas that are there, the majority of them, or rather a last vast majority of them, 44 of them, are actually named after streets. They are not really uh, they are not really mohallas in that kind of sense. I mean, the kind of sense which, say, whether it is Jamal Malik or Stephen Blake are suggesting as the sealed homogeneous units. How can a sealed homogeneous unit be a street? So, the kind of streets that is are mentioned, Dariba Kalan, Bazar Chitli Kabar. There's even Zafar Hassan actually names one mohalla road from Ajmeri Gate to Qazi Ka Haus. Obviously, that's not a mohalla. He's basically mentioning a street. But because J.A. Page is organizing it according to mohallas and cannot understand that this is not a mohalla, it's a street, he puts it down within the mohallas. So that is a very interesting thing, I find, that so many of these are actually streets. And in fact, Sangin Beg also, if you look at his text, he uses bazaar as a category, uh, rasta as a category, much more than he uses mohalla. So he is using that. Then there are other category of mohalla, which is the landmark mohallas. So these are named after landmarks. Kodia Pul, which is was an important bridge. Turkman Gate. Then there is a Mohalla Chitli Kabar. Even though there's a separate Bazar Chitli Kabar, there's one Mohalla Chitli Kabar also. Sangin Beg also mentions some of these mohallas: Mohalla Noghara, Rehet Ka Mohalla, Mohalla Masjid Khajur. So he mentions these, which are named after landmarks. The neighborhood around Masjid Khajur is Mohalla Masjid Khajur. It is not named after a particular kind and category and caste of people who are living there necessarily. And this is, in fact, Mohalla Masjid Khajur is inside that Dariba area. So it's inside the Dariba, right next to where you have your Dharampura and all the Jain temples, etc. So there is no, the sense that there are these communities of artisans, different castes, different class. You don't get that sense from this. So landmark mohallas, another very important category, 26 of them. Then there are others which are named after Havelis, Katras, Chattas. Now, Haveli Heather Kuli, which I had named, uh, as I said, by the 19th century, it had actually become a mohalla because there were a lot of people living there. It was a full neighborhood. Haveli Nawab Muzaffar Khan, that's another mohalla which is again near the Turkman Gate area. Chatta Shahji, which is again bordering Chowdi Bazaar. So these are all two kinds of origins of this name. One is that there were old Havelis which have now become mohallas, like Haveli Heather Kuli, or it could be an important landmark. It could be an important Haveli which has lent its name to the surrounding areas, like Chatta Shaji. It's a chatta, a covered space, and that has not only got a lot of people living in it or working in it, but it has given its name to the wider uh, area as well. It's a mohalla. So these, the landmark mohalla, the spaces wale nomenclature again is not giving you the idea of the caste and profession and all which we are supposed to be looking for. Place names. This is an important place names which I should mention because uh, again there are I have not put it in this particular category, but it should have been there. Dharampura, Bhotla Pahad, Naya Bas, Sangin Beg also mentioned several of these. Imli ka mohalla, mohalla Bulbuli Khana, mohalla Bhojla Pahadi, mohalla Kalyanpura, mohalla Roshanpura. These are place names. What their actual histories are sometimes lost in time, but these are place names. These are not named after specific people or the specific ethnicity or caste, etc. That's quite obvious. Then finally, we come to the mohallas, which are named after the occupational or ethnic identities. Now, this is the kind of mohalla that we are supposed to be looking out for. The homogeneous, socially, culturally homogeneous mohallas that we are supposed to be looking out at. So, there are only of this whole lot, there are only 90 of this kind. So, of the 114 mohallas that are named by Zafar Hassan, only 19 conform to that particular category of caste or class or ethnic group or a profession. So there is Jatwara, Mochiyo ki gali, Mohalla Dhobiyan. Sangin Beg also mentioned some. Mohalla Kashti Banan, Mohalla Rudkaran, Mohalla Chudikaran, Mohalla Dhobiwala, Panwadiyon ka Mohalla, Mohalla he also mentions Jatwara. So you have some of these. But again, some of these are and undoubtedly uh, ones which are, of course, I can also mention things like Kashmiri Katra, for instance, and there are other areas where people of a particular community, particularly regional identity gather. There is Punjabi Katra, there is Kashmiri Katra, there is the Katra Neel, where a lot of Khatris settle down. So the Kashmiris settle down in the area just off Sitaram Bazar. So there is this happening, and that happens in any city because when particularly people coming from outside a particular ethnic group comes and settles in a small group of family comes and settles in a particular place, then all further immigrants of that community of that particular ethnic group are tempted to go and settle next to where people of their ethnicity are settled in a particular city. So that often happens. The other thing that often happens is that people who are of a particular occupational group, which may be using similar raw materials, often find it useful, or using similar retail spaces might find it useful to settle in close proximity to each other. So that is undoubtedly a factor in how communities settle. So therefore, in fact, Sangeet Beg also mentions this. So this is he'll mention that this is a bazaar, which is essentially that of people who make brass utensils, for instance. So he will make those kind of statements. So it is not as if people are not gathering according to uh, their occupations or caste. But what I am saying is that we don't have any evidence that they are sealing themselves off. They are making it a homogeneous group in residential terms, in working terms, or that they work as a corporate group in their private lives or their semi-private existence inside the mohalla, that they do everything as a group, not only their professional lives but as their primary identity is that. So that I find difficult to find. Now, some of these streets which are identified by some of these scholars are also a little problematic. So one of them is, for instance, Mohalla Masjid Panipatiya. Now, Masjid Panipatiya actually is a masjid which was there in the northern part of Shahjahanabad. And if you look at the inscription on that masjid, it actually said that it was built by one Lutfullah Khan Sadiq of Panipat. So it's not पानीपतियों की इन दैट सेंस कि यहाँ पे मोहल्ला था और उसमें सब पानीपत के लोग रहते थे एंड everybody then and therefore that is their their caste mohalla mosque. You must also realize that the name of the mohalla is not mohalla Panipatiya. It is Mohalla Masjid Panipatiya. So we have to look at it again as one of those landmark mohallas. It is named after a landmark. It's named after the masjid. The masjid is not named after the mohalla. So again, what you are seeing, another very interesting example is that in one of these essays, I also came across the idea that Gurwala is, you know, Gurwala is which is a name given to one of the streets, is related to all the people who were, either retailing or producing or selling good, which is raw sugar or jaggery. Now, that is not the case because Gurwala is a very prominent trading family in Delhi of the 19th century. And even now they are there. And they are in the same place. They are still in Dariba. They still have their establishment there. So, some of these are misunderstandings of this sort. Um, so, what I'm trying to sum up in this argument is that this whole model of the mohalla as the primary unit of organization is, I am not convinced by it. I think often what you see, at least from the 19th century sources, is a city where you have a a lot of heterogeneous population. Yes, there is some congregation of people with some common background in some areas, but it is not it is not by imperial diktat at all. This is a natural organic process that is happening. And certainly, if you are looking at the built fabric, you walk through Shahjahanabad, you will not see those high walls that are posited in this model. You will not see those high walls separating mohallas. Yes, there are some gates, but gates which are at the head of streets. They, one thing is there that in our Indian culture, building of gates has a very different meaning. Gate does not necessarily only mean something which seals off a place. A gate is also a place which leads to another place. So very many important places of worship, important cities, important city is different because it has a city wall. But a lot of places have a gate not to close the place, but to give it a proper, give you a proper reception into the space actually. So I would see a lot of the gates like that because I don't see the accompanying walls which are supposedly sealing off the particular mohalla. And of course, as I have pointed out here, there are it is many to look at the mohalla, you have to look at the very shall we say heterogeneous and it's how I see Sangin Beg interpreting a mohalla is as in a very general sense a kind of neighborhood कि इस इलाके में इस जो मस्जिद खजूर है इसके जो अराउंड का जो जो इलाका इसके चारों तरफ है इसको दिस इज कॉल्ड मोहल्ला मस्जिद खजूर there's no more, nothing more than that. It's in a very general sense a neighborhood. It is not sharply distinguished from the next neighborhood. They kind of blend in. Also in one neighborhood you'll find many different kinds of people who are populating it. So that really brings me to the end of the arguments that I had to make over here. They are tentative and work in progress, and I really hope that somebody will take this further and investigate some of these things further. The last slide here I really wanted to put up because it's a photograph which was taken sometime in the late 19th century. It shows the area, I showed you the print which sketch which shows the view from the Red Fort to the Jama Masjid. This happened after 1857. There were a lot of changes. A lot of demolitions took place. So, in fact, the city now is large parts are missing. And one of the parts that is missing is all the construction that was there between the Red Fort and the Jama Masjid. That was wiped away. So all that you see now is subsequent development. And this shows the period when there was nothing in the middle. So it's a contrast to um, uh, that particular scene that I had shown you. That was from the 1840s. This is a few decades later than that. I will stop sharing my screen here. And there you go.
Uh, Thank you for a really excellent lecture. Uh,
So much.
Remarkable, remarkable. Uh, uh, you know, uh, I wish that someone would also, in the subsequent weeks or months, carry this argument forward with special studies of places like Agra, uh, in a similar vein, or for that matter, the town on which I have worked, Fatehpur Sikri. However, um, you know, when I was listening to what you had to say today, I was reminded of two things. As your title suggests, that the 19th century Delhi is inspired from the Shahjahanabad of the Mughals. That's very much explicitly there. Uh, you know, uh, there is. I would agree with you. There's nothing like Islamic city. I mean, a Christian city would be having a church. A Hindu city, Hampi, would be having temples. As you rightly pointed out, that whether it was in Delhi or I can say about Fatehpur Sikri, the Jama Masjid at both the places, or for that matter at Agra, the Jama Masjids came later on. They were never in the center at all. They were given prominence, there's no doubt. But the concept of Islamic city, which is tried to be given to the Mughal cities like Agra or Fatehpur Sikri or to Delhi, I think is, has no sense at all. Uh, Pelsert, who visited Agra and also went to Sikri, also visited Delhi during the reign of Jahangir, mentions one fact which is true for all these cities, and that is that within these Mughal cities, he specifically mentions Agra and Fatehpur Sikri and Shahjahanabad, or Delhi is also implicitly out there. Uh, mm, mm, you know, uh, in all these cities, the mohallas, the population which he mentions is mixed. He says Hindus live with Muslims, poor with the rich, so on and so forth. Even in fact, during Shah Jahan's period, the time when your Shahjahanabad is being constructed, we have an account from a person who was residing in Lahore. He was a non-Muslim, Surat Singh. He is writing an account of his Pir, Pir Hasuteli. Uh, he was a petty bureaucrat, a very small, clerical position, but he bought a house in Lahore, and then he mentions the mohalla, who is living where, and we get the same impression that all type of religious communities, even rich and poor. Surat Singh himself was a very ordinary person, and near him was the haveli of a noble. So, whatever you were telling today, I was instantly reminded of that. Secondly, I was reminded of another work which was done at just another time altogether with a different approach. That was, I think, in 1970s. by a person who was at Aligarh, Mahendra Pratap Singh, MP Singh. He did a book on the port towns and cities. That book is now probably out of print. But there he went on to discuss about the various types of mohallas which he encountered in those port cities. Mm, Right. So, what I mean, just trying to say is that these works, whether they are the original sources like Pelsearch or works which were done during the 20th century in a very traditional way, like MP Singh, researches which I have done at Fatehpur Sikri, and now whatever you are saying, all try to give a very uniform picture, where number one, Stephen Blake is in fact totally negated. In fact, Stephen Blake also ultimately, I'm told that he gave up with this theory of patrimonial bureaucratic empire itself. He is no more, uh, giving that thesis anymore. He has changed his views. Uh, uh, even if he has given it up or not given it up, the new researchers support your point of view, and that is that the development of the city during the medieval period, say from 14th century onwards, and I'll give an explanation for that, uh, was not based on any type of religion or community. Banyas were living together with the Molvis, for example, in Gujarat, in Surat, in Cambay, in Ahmedabad. There are a large number of documents which go to prove the same thing. You doing work on Delhi are fortunate enough that you have got two or three maps and plans which are present for you to actually come out with a very tangible sort of argument, which unfortunately is missing as far as other places are generally concerned. Before I start taking up questions, I would also like to just point out one more thing, and that is the development of the city of Tughlaqabad, very near to Shah Jahan. If one looks at the plan of Tughlaqabad, you find the same thing which you were trying to explain as far as the concept of Islamic city is concerned. That there is a city part which is public, there is something which is semi-public, and there is a part which is totally reserved for the nobility and the emperor. Most of the towns in Central Asia, Balkh, Badakhshan, Samarkand, hmm, Herat, possibly some of these towns, we are told, informed the development at Tughlaqabad. And that is why, if you look at the plan of Tughlaqabad, which has been given to us by a lot of historians, uh, and also recreated by aerial photographs, the entire city is divided into three parts. Hmm. The part where the Qila is there, the fort where the emperor is living, that area is further divided into two parts: the absolutely private fortification, and a larger one where you have the public offices and so on and so forth. And lastly, a portion which is not actually on the hill itself, but below the hill, the Pine Shahar, where the population itself was residing. I think it would be a good idea if some scholar at some later stage takes up a comparative study from Tughlaqabad to Shah Jahan. Similar ideas but differently presented took place. Uh, uh, One last thing which One question before. I mean, there are many other things I am just forgetting. I'll ask you whenever it is, whenever I remember them. One thing which, two things which I wanted to ask before we start taking up questions from others. Uh, Now, you have studied the mohallas, whether they are named after the street or the profession or whatever. You also mentioned the various occupations and products, um, and places, important places on which the mohallas were named. I wanted to know, if you look at the entire plan of the city, do you find any socially hierarchical setting up of the city itself? For example, nearest to the fort, one class of people living, and then when I started work on Fatehpur Sikri, Athar Abbas Rizvi, for example, in one of his articles, pointed out that the lower professions and groups, ironsmiths and so on and so forth, were living only at the periphery of the town, and all the others, I mean, as you go higher status in the society, they were living near the palatial complex. Do you find anything of that sort uh, at Shahjahanabad, whether during the 18th century or 19th century? That is my question number one to you. Secondly, ma'am, uh, uh, you know, if you look at the mm, Delhi's before Shahjahanabad, or for that matter, the development of the urban areas before Shah Jahan. Sikri was developing very near to the Khanqa of a Sufi saint, Salim Chishti. Uh, you know, mm, the Delhi in the early Mughal period, or for that matter, even under Sher Shah, Humayun, Sher Shah, in fact, even whatever was there under Babar, all situated, or in fact, from Tolak period onwards, situated near the shrine of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia. Or if you go back in time, the whole Qutub complex
Yeah.
being, near the Dargah of a saint. Suddenly, during Shah Jahan's time, uh, um, there is no particular shrine or religious center around which the city of Shah Jahanabad starts developing. Any reasons for that? I mean, yeah, as a historian, I know, as a Mughal historian, I mean, we are told that Shah Jahan was much more, religious. He was, in fact, the Hanafi Sunni Muslim who was trying to assert religion even before Aurangzeb started doing that. But as far as his city is concerned, this thing is not found. So these are some of the things which I wanted to ask you. If you want to answer them, please do, because after that we will be taking up the other questions.
So I'll take your second question first because I don't know about this. Why, or whether there is any, apart from, shall we say, maybe that I'm having a senior moment here. There's a shrine in Bulbuli Khana, one old dargah of the 13th century. Apart from that, really there is not no significant dargah, and even at that point, we don't have any evidence that the Mughals particularly revered the saint there. So therefore, you are quite right that there is no such association of this particular site within Delhi. However, it may have been why Shah Jahan picks Delhi in the first place. I think that the two elements are definitely there. One is temporal power. It is the Kubbatul Islam, the whole idea that, you have the Sultanate has ruled from there, the early Mughals have spent some time there. So that is there, and the spiritual aura is there. All the Sufis are, the Sufi aura is in Delhi, particularly the Chishtis, etc. So therefore, that idea is there. The fact that it is not taken up as in close proximity, the site is chosen because of various other reasons, presumably might have to do with topography, etc. We don't know, but I think it's not very significant in the sense that the general idea that yes, this is area which has that spiritual aura. That's the only explanation I have. As far as your other question is concerned, I don't find that really, because you have some of the biggest Havelis are actually at the peripheries. So you have Kamaruddin Khan's Haveli in near Ajmeri Gate. You have the Nawab Wazir's Sadat Khan and your Safdar Jang's Haveli at the extreme end. It's like north of Fatehpuri Masjid. So bilkul extreme end pe hai. Uh, there are some professions which need to stay near the city walls. गडरियों का मोहल्ला, अब गडरिये अपनी सब चीज लेके बिल्कुल यहाँ तो नहीं आ जाएंगे ना, in the middle of the city. So they for various operational reasons may need to be near this thing, but otherwise you can see कि एक बिग नोबल की हवेली है, लाइक नवाब मुजफ्फर खान हवेली नियर तुर्कमान गेट, उसी के साथ में साइड में टैनर्स का एक सेटलमेंट है. सो it is like a very very mixed population that you are seeing there. And it comes out so beautifully both in the map as well as the text, that you cannot have these hard and fast rules कि इस तरह से है. It is all extremely heterogeneous. So those are your two questions.
Right, right. Let us take up the questions which have been put up by our viewers. Ali Heather, why Delhi Renaissance is not as famous as Bengal Renaissance? What was the relationship of 19th century Delhi with Sikh Empire and Durrani Empire?
Uh, if you're looking at the 19th century Delhi during the time of the Mughals, the Mughals have no political role, uh, no formal political, or let me put it this way, it is the East India Company which actually rules Delhi and rules the Mughal emperor, even though they prop up the Mughal emperor as a sort of front. So it is, you are really talking about that. Also, what is happening is that the Mughal emperor, however, has very strong symbolic power. So the Sikhs, in fact, are they are posting their wakils in Delhi to as to keep track of what is going on at the Mughal court, also at the court of the resident. They are, all these powers. In fact, they, for instance, struck their coins in the name of the Mughal emperor, even when the East India Company was on the ascendant and it was in control of Delhi, and when they the East India Company itself struck its coins in the name of the Mughal emperor. So, the huge amount of symbolic importance is there. But the Mughal emperors were not really in the 19th century taking any uh, uh, direct part in the political or diplomatic negotiations with these powers. It is, and it's all the East India Company and its politics with the Sikhs, etc. You will probably generally find. As far as the Delhi Renaissance is concerned, I have done a little bit of work on this, and I can, to sum it up in one sentence, it's because of 1857. 1857 so comprehensively finished off all the kind of intellectual vitality, the kind of uh, progressive thinking, and all that had started to, the intellectual ferment that was there in Delhi. And there's a lot of intellectual ferment in that first half of the 19th century, which is taking place in Delhi. The problem is that 1857, because it was such a traumatic episode, and so many of the Delhi people had to leave the city and go away. And the in fact, the Delhi College closes down. All those kind of things happen, and that means that, and it's also a atmosphere of fear. So people don't even talk about the old days anymore, for a long, long time. So therefore, there is, I think 1857 is the defining feature of that, so that we, even the memory of that so-called Delhi Renaissance is kind of wiped out, unless until Zakaullah talks about it to CF Andrews, and then CF Andrews calls it the Delhi Renaissance.
Uh, right. I mean, would you also like to comment on the Sheher Ashhob literature? Uh,
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I have particularly looked at it in the context of 1857,
mm,
and it's a very, very complex story. Who are the people who talk about, who are the, how in retrospect people look back to see what the Mughal court was, what 1857 is, why, what, where their loyalties lie, where their pragmatism lies. It's a very, very complex political commentary. It's an important social commentary also, because a lot of people who were not in favor of the, and a lot of the elite in Delhi were not in favor of the revolt. But that's not because they love the British, but because they are really afraid of the kind of social upheaval that is coming to the fore, the kind of disorders that they see, the upturning of class hierarchies, all those kind of things.
right.
So it's the conservatism that comes to the fore, and they reject the revolt in some ways, or don't support it so wholeheartedly. And that comes out in some of the Sheher Ashok poetry of that period.
Right. Uh, let's have another question. Pankaj Sharma. Ma'am, I read somewhere that originally Shah Jahan wanted his city Shahjahanabad obliviously in Agra itself, but reluctance of businessmen to shift from existing places to make way for a new city forced him to look for Delhi. Can you please throw light on reasons for shifting to Delhi?
um, I must confess that I am not very familiar with the sources of Shah Jahan's reign itself, so I cannot, with great authority, speak on this particular idea. But from what I can gather, it seems very much that it was again Shah Jahan's impulse to build a large city, and I don't think he would even have contemplated the idea of clearing away large parts of an existing city to rebuild it. I don't think that that would have occurred to him, that ye karo aise. I think he, once he had decided that he wanted to build a new city, he just sent people out to go and look for suitable sites. And as I said, that Delhi was important because it has this aura of spiritual as well as temporal power. And I think that was the overriding reason for that shift. It was not simply that you want a clean slate to build on, and Agra is not providing that clean slate. I think the shift of the capital has this additional thing also in it.
I will add a little to what Saftaji has just answered, and that is that the region of Delhi or Delhi itself had a very symbolic, meaning uh, during the 16th, 17th centuries. Although uh, Akbar had actually shifted from Delhi to Agra, uh, rebuilding the Lodi fort at Agra and making it his capital. But actually, Delhi was never abandoned as one of the imperial cities of the Mughals. Number one. Number two, when Shah Jahan started with his building projects, as Swapnaji said, that he had people hunting out for good locations where the city could be placed. And there is a source known as Patsha Nama of Varis, which tells us that these engineers and architects, they were hunting for a suitable place, and they were being helped by a large number of astrologers and astronomers. And all these people together, chose a site on the banks of river Yamuna at the curve of the river Yamuna, which was thought to be very auspicious. So in the first half of Shah Jahan's reign, we have most of his, projects, building projects, confined to Delhi. But later on, after the site had been identified, and after astrologers had in fact calculated at what time and which place to start building, Shah Jahan, shifted to, Delhi. Uh, the site which was chosen was not only on the riverbed, the site chosen by the astrologers and the architects, a suitable place for a good, fort to develop, but it was also not very far from the Deen Panah of his forefathers. It was exactly a connect between the early Mughals and the new city which Shah Jahan was building. It was, in a way, what Shah Jahan was trying to do was that he was trying to reconnect with the past. Remember that Delhi, from the times of ancient period, from prehistoric period, had been known as the capital city of India. In between, Kannauj had taken up that position for certain period of years, but ultimately it was Delhi during medieval period. जो दिल्ली का बादशाह होता था
Yeah.
वो हिंदुस्तान का बादशाह होता था, तो जब आगरे में भी थे तो दिल्ली कभी कम नहीं हुआ था. And taking advantage of that and taking inspiration from his own forefathers, Shah Jahan started developing this entire city. And one more thing before Pankaj ji, which I would like to add is that remember, जो यहाँ एक स्पेस इनको मिला था, एक बिल्कुल जो एरिया इन्होंने चूज किया था, वहां पे कोई इससे पहले खास डेवलपमेंट टर्किश पीरियड में या सल्तनत पीरियड में नहीं था. इनफैक्ट जो तुगलक पीरियड में भी जो डेवलपमेंट था वो पास पे ज़रूर आ जाता था, क्योंकि तुगलक पीरियड में आपके फिरोज शाह कोटला से लेके और जहाँ आपका बड़ा हिंदू राव हॉस्पिटल है वहाँ तक का एक तरीके से तुगलक कैपिटल फैला हुआ था. लेकिन ये जो साइट चुनी गई थी, इस पे बहुत ज़्यादा मॉन्यूमेंट्स उस वक्त मौजूद नहीं थे. बिल्कुल एक ओपन ग्राउंड मिल गया था जहाँ पे ये बनवाया. और एक रिमार्केबल चीज पंकज शर्मा जी ये है कि जहाँ पे इन्होंने किला बनाया, जैसे स्वप्ना जी ने अपने लेक्चर में कहा कि जो सेंट्रल प्लेस है वो उस फोर्ट की थी, लेकिन उसके जस्ट सामने बिल्कुल जहाँ से वो बिल्कुल एक तरीके से अगर आप प्रकार रख के खींचें, अगर इनके प्लान के ऊपर जो वो 18th सेंचुरी का प्लान दिखाया जाता है, तो जहाँ पे बिल्कुल कोर एरिया आएगा वहीं पे वो जैन टेम्पल बनी. बिल्कुल. मतलब सिर्फ ये नहीं है कि टेम्पल बनाई गई, इट वाज गिवन सच ए प्रोमिनेंट इंपॉर्टेंट प्लेस कि जो पूरा जो एक शाह राह थी जिसे कहते हैं, जो रॉयल हाईवे जो पैलेस से निकल के और सीधे आगे जाता था, द पॉइंट फ्रॉम वेयर इट वुड स्टार्ट वाज द जैन टेम्पल, वेयर इट एंडेड वाज अ मॉस्क. सो इसको भी आप याद रखें, द टाइप ऑफ कैपिटल जहाँ के ऊपर एक बिल्कुल ओपन एरिया में जो शाहजहां को स्पेस मिली थी. तो आई थिंक दीज आर द थिंग्स which one has to remember. Next question, please. Surinder Walia. So, in nutshell, it's a happy. No, uh,
Sorry.
any information on any of the businesses and residents who are continuing since the days of Shah Jahan?
Uh, well, there are some old Jain banking families whose descendants are still in Delhi. I will not, in a public forum, just take out names, but there are. So, in fact, those are some of the older. There must be there are others also.
Any other question? Is there any
There
other
are.
question?
I
Yeah.
can read some over here.
You Hassan, he says, fascinating talk. Is there any information available about demographics, the price of land in the various stages of the development and evolution of the city, how land was parceled out, and if there was any concept of a building license, city plan, or blueprint regulating the development and growth of Shahjahanabad.
Um, our sources from the Mughal period, I am not very familiar with. 19th century, I do know a little bit about. Uh, Demographics, the British used to have regular censuses. So we do know. I mentioned a figure of a lakh and 50,000 by the time of 1857 comes around. In the early 1850s, it's about a lakh and 50,000 within the city walls. Price of land also, I can't offhand tell you, but there are enough sources, just even letters, etc. You can find out the some of the prices that people paid for various bits of land. It's not very difficult to find that. um, how land was parceled out, if there was any concept of a building license, as I said, what we do find is that a lot of the mohalla development that is taking place, the neighborhood development, as I said, not the traditional kind of idea of a mohalla as a very formal unit, a lot of it is, shall we say, organic growth that is taking place. This is not being dictated by any. There are some things that are being dictated. For instance, the main streets, the bazaar streets, uska kahan tak wo patri aayegi aapki, and what are the awnings that you will have, etc. There was a uniformity on the main street. That was for aesthetic reasons that you find that some of that was imposed, which was there in the earlier Mughal times also. In fact, by the colonial times, that was collapsing a little bit. That was not, in fact, some of the infrastructure by the colonial times was collapsing, like the sewer system. They had a very good drainage system in Shahjahanabad, and a lot of those drains, which, in fact, Sayyid Ahmad Khan tells us that had become dysfunctional by the time the British came around. So all those things were happening. So as I said, some regulation, some not. A balance between these, and of course, the British put in, regulations as far as licensing and all is concerned. And in fact, a lot of our institutions of licensing, plans and all that, it owes itself to the British period, and that is from the company, but more from after 1857.
Again, just a bit of information to add. Uh, you know, uh, One of the first sources uh, for the development of Shah Jahanabad is the Padshanama of Waris. Uh, there are a number of Padshanamas: Waris, Qazvini, Lahori, so on and so forth. I mean, in total, there are around five Padshanamas which were composed during the period of Shah Jahan. One of the first was the Pachanama of Waris. Unfortunately, it has yet to be edited and published. Uh, we have, it in a manuscript form in British Library, but there are, passages there which mention the development of Shah Jahanabad. From that, we come to know that at a time when Shah Jahan decided to take up the site at Delhi on this river bank, orders were issued to the nobles and common people to build their havelis. This is what he writes. Similarly, at Fatehpur Sikri in 1571, when Akbar started building his first palace, there was a decree which was issued by the emperor asking the nobles and others to acquire land and start building up their havelis and mansions out there. Whether there was, a license given, what was the manner in which it was all given, we are not sure. But at least one thing is quite sure, that it was the imperial decree which ordered these people कि ये capital है, यहाँ हमारा है, इसके आगे बनाइए. Number one. Number two, that is something which I have discussed in my book on Fatehpur Sikri. Most of these, टाउन्स, मुगल टाउन्स, चाहे वो आगरा हो, चाहे वो फतेहपुर सीकरी हो, चाहे वो शाहजहानाबाद, they are basically inspired from the moving encampment of the Mughals.
Yeah.
Hmm. The Basha Salamat, you know that the Mughals were peripatetic by nature. They were moving from one place to another. And while they were moving, it was the entire city which was moving along with them. बादशाह थे तो बादशाह के साथ उनके खानदान था, खानदान के साथ उनके नोबिलिटी थी, नोबिलिटी के साथ उनके फॉलोअर्स थे, और इतने बहुत से लोगों के साथ उन नोबल्स के साथ आर्मी मैन थे, और सबको खाना खिलाने के लिए मर्चेंट्स थे और दुकान वाले थे, so on and so forth. So the camp, when it was on the move, at least would be having 20, 25 or more than that, 1,000 people moving together with the emperor. तो उसको रात में पड़ाव डालने के लिए एक बाकायदा एक प्लान मौजूद था, जिसकी बेसिस पे वो सेटलमेंट किया जाता था, एंड इट वाज ऑल वेल लेड आउट. जो चीज स्वप्ना जी ने जब हमें बताई, वो चीज बिल्कुल सामने नजर आ रही है. ये बताया गया इसमें प्लान में कि देखिए यहाँ एम्परर हैं, आप यहाँ पे ये डालिए, नोबिलिटी यहाँ पे होगी, फला यहाँ पे होगा, बाजार यहाँ पे होगा. अब इंटरनल उसका जो डेवलपमेंट है, कौन किधर लगाएगा, वो आप डिसाइड करो. दैट इज नॉट टू बी प्लान. सो एक तरीके से वी कैन से दैट देयर वाज अ सेमी अर्बन प्लानिंग. आधा आपको दे दिया गया कि ये एरियाज एलोकेट कर दिए गए एज पर द ट्रेडिशन ऑफ द मुगल एनकैम्पमेंट, किस साइड पे कौन होगा. अब उस एरिया को डेवलप करने में कोई उस बारीकी में, उस टाइप का, जैसे आपने अगर ये जो आपका पंजाब का जो चंडीगढ़ जिस टाइप से बनाया गया, वैसी कोई प्लानिंग नहीं. एक लेआउट दे दिया, जैसे स्वप्ना जी ने बताया कि मेन उसकी जो सड़कें थी वो लेआउट कर दी गई. अब आप उसके आगे जो आपको करना है, दैट वाज हाउ द डेवलपमेंट एट दिस प्लेस वाज. बस लास्ट वन थिंग, के जो सोर्सेज हैं, स्वप्ना जी 19th सेंचुरी के बारे में बताएंगी. एज फार एज 17th century is concerned, there is lot of information, unfortunately all in Persian, which do tell us about the prices of these mansions and lands. And I would suggest whosoever is interested, there is an article by Professor Irfan Habib, another by Professor Shirin Muswi, which they might consult, जहाँ पे इन prices को जो buildings की थी और बनाने में थी और खरीदने में थी और ये सारी चीज़ें वो एक डिस्कस की गई हैं. इस पे काम एक कंसंट्रेट होके एक साथ होना बाकी है, बट देर इज इंफॉर्मेशन विच इज प्रेजेंट. अशोक माथुर जी, ma'am, my question is that how much do you feel that your personal research on Shahjahanabad is helping us in preserving our heritage today? Do you think it's more important for the authorities to look more into what's happening beyond the existing heritage buildings than just pinpointing only the existing ones? The real problem lies in what is happening to the city more than what can be done to the heritage buildings.
Um, you have absolutely said exactly the right thing. We cannot look at heritage buildings without looking at the city. In fact, that's what we had done when we were making that dossier for UNESCO. Uh, our aim was that you look at the city, you look at the plan. These are the important things. The buildings are important, of course, but it's the city as a whole. You cannot ignore the city as a whole and its logic. One of the things that I've not talked about in this discussion, but should also be form a part of any study that is done, the courtyard house. the,
Exactly.
the courtyard house is a very important plan. You have to preserve it. Agar aap, if you start building the normal kind of, a block of flats in Shahjahanabad, that ruins the absolutely, your quality of life goes down. You've ruined the urban fabric. So those kind of things, the plans of the houses that are built, not only the heritage houses, the other houses which are being built. Very right you are. That's very important. There is a disaster in the shape of a new mall that is coming up there. Shahjahanabad is not the place for a mall. I mean, you can build your malls elsewhere. So these are the kind of things. Holistically, you need to look at the place, the fabric, the streets, the people who live there. Very, very important to look at the people who live there. What are their needs and how they can be accommodated. You have to find developmental models which will not wreck the heritage. And heritage again is not just the buildings. So you are very true. I don't think my research is making any contribution. वो चलता है उसका वो the way it is going on, it is going on. I have no contribution to make now.
M.G. Gopalan ji, in fact, when she's talking about Shahjahanabad, she's talking about Delhi. The difference is that Delhi is much larger, which includes other parts also. Shahjahanabad is only that part of the city which was originally built during the period of Shah Jahan himself. वो बाद में फिर वो अंग्रेजों ने भी उसको टेकअप किया, दूसरों ने टेकअप किया. तो दिल्ली का ही बात हो रही है, लेकिन उस पर्टिकुलर एरिया की बात हो रही है जो मुगलों के पीरियड में डेवलप हुआ था.
And it's very odd that once the British built New Delhi, then Shahjahanabad became Old Delhi. In fact,
Yes.
it happened with every city. के एक नया city बनता है, so the old city becomes, the older city becomes the old city. So that is one factor.
एक अभी किसी ने कमेंट किया था, आई जस्ट ठीक से नहीं, निगम बोध घाट के ऊपर. Yes, that is also very much an integral part, Digambod Ghat, an integral part of the city of Shahjahanabad. It's by Ashok Mathur. You are quite correct. कि जो पूरा जो जहाँ के ऊपर ये बसाया गया वहीं के ऊपर आप इससे आप जरा मुगलों को पहचानने की कोशिश कीजिए. हाउ दे वर वेरी डिफरेंट फ्रॉम 21st सेंचुरी इंडियंस. आज हम लोग जो बन रहे हैं उससे बिल्कुल मुख्तलिफ लोग वो थे, और इसको हमें समझना चाहिए इस चीज को. थैंक यू मैम. आई थिंक देयर इज अनदर क्वेश्चन. Ma'am, when did the real chaffing of ethnicity happen? I mean, when did people of a particular ethnicity started living in groups at a particular place? My own caste community could only be found living in Roshanpura, Roshan, Dola, Katra, Chini Khana, Kinari Bazar, Chehelpuri, etc.
Yeah, I agree. For various reasons, as I said, often people of a particular ethnicity, caste, etc. Already you have given a sort of a general area where the castes were living. So it used to happen because they shared some, some cultural affiliations. The local temple is there, etc. Some of that was there, but I am just saying that despite these, this is not the predominant organizing principle. And I'm sure this, to some extent, this was already starting in Shah Jahan's time. Also, it's human nature. You settle next to your, even your extended family, your kinship group, and all that. वो सब होता है. But I'm just saying कि जो rigid तरीके से देखते हैं of sealed off mohallas and all that, वो हमें नहीं दिखता है यहाँ पे.
अशोक माथुर जी, बिल्कुल जो स्वप्ना जी ने कहा वो सिर्फ शाहजहानाबाद के लिए ट्रू नहीं है, और स्पेशली 19th सेंचुरी शाहजहानाबाद के लिए ट्रू नहीं है. वो इनफैक्ट अर्लियर पीरियड में भी ये डेवलपमेंट जैसा इन्होंने बताया वो नजर आता है चारों तरफ. लाहौर से लेके, दिल्ली से लेके, आगरा से लेके, किसी शहर को देख लीजिए. ये ह्यूमन नेचर है कि एक टाइप के लोग एक जगह बसने की कोशिश करते हैं. द ओनली थिंग इज कि एक्सक्लूसिव, जैसे आज गुजरात में मसलन हो रहा है कि एक मोहल्ला अगर है तो इसके अलावा कोई आपको नहीं वहां मिलेगा. या यूपी में जहां मैं रह रहा हूँ, जिस शहर में, अलीगढ़ जिसका नाम है, जो महल्ला मुसलमानों का है वहां पे हिंदू घर लेते हुए डरते हैं, और जहां पे हिंदुओं का महल्ला है वहां मुझे किराए पे मुसलमान, चाहे जितना भी नाम नेहाद मुसलमान हो, मुझे घर नहीं मिलेगा. ये एक मॉडर्न फिनोमेना है. जो स्वप्ना जी कह रही हैं या जो मैं बताना चाह रहा हूँ वो सिर्फ ये है कि जाहिर है प्रीडोमिनेंस किसी एक पर्टिकुलर ग्रुप की हो सकती है, जो कास्ट बेस्ड भी हो सकती है, प्रोफेशन बेस्ड भी हो सकती है, या गुड्स बेस्ड भी हो सकती है. वो अपनी जगह पे है. मसलन एक चीज बेचने वाले एक साथ एक एक जगह के ऊपर, एक कटरा फला, एक है जो मोहल्ला उस टाइप का बन जाएगा. बट व्हाट वी आर ट्राइंग टू पॉइंट आउट इज कि इसके अलावा भी दूसरे लोग भी इक्वली वहां पे रह रहे हों. सिर्फ इतना सा फर्क है. जाहिर है प्रीडोमिनेंस कास्ट या प्रोफेशन बेस्ड जरूर होती थी, और जाहिर है कि जैसे आपने बताया कि आपके कास्ट के लोग वो एक जगह के ऊपर रह रहे हैं, इसी तरह से दूसरे कास्ट के लोग प्रीडोमिनेंटली दूसरी जगह हैं, लेकिन उनके साथ दूसरी इंटरमिक्सिंग भी इस महल्ले में नजर आती है. डॉक्टर स्वप्ना लिटिल, आई थिंक you did a great job.
Thank
um,
you.
uh, there are many other questions, and naturally people want to ask you more. But taking privilege of a privileged position where I'm sitting before the camera asking you, so I'll take up a few more minutes of yours. You know, I wanted to know, and I had forgotten to ask it at that point of time. जब आप शाहजहानाबाद से आप 19th सेंचुरी तक आती, शाहजहानाबाद आप नाम ले रही हैं तो जाहिर है कि उस पीरियड से शुरू होता है. तो तो एक तरीके से मुगल इंपीरियल टाउन से जो शिफ्ट है इनटू अ कॉलोनियल टाउन ऑफ 19th सेंचुरी, क्या एस्पेक्ट्स हैं जो आपको नए या बदले हुए नजर आते हैं? सो व्हाट are the I mean components which transform the Mughal imperial city into a colonial city of the 19th century? Can you elaborate on
One of the things, I mean, again, the colonial city as such, I think वो जो profound transformation है वो 1857 के बाद आता है, जब रेलवेज आ जाती हैं, जब घंटा घर इज अ प्रोमिनेंट लैंडमार्क, सेंट्रल लैंडमार्क, यू नो द रेलवेज, द घंटा घर, द टाउन हॉल, these become important landmarks. That phase comes after 1857. Before 1857, what is happening is that the British are really locating themselves in a enclave towards the north. कश्मीरी गेट के अराउंड एक एनक्लेव सा बना दिया है, वहां पे वो रह रहे हैं. सो इन really pre 1857 they are, as far as their living etc is concerned, their impact is very limited. Architecturally impact है because वो खुद अब western style buildings कुछ कुछ बना रहे हैं, और साथ में Delhi people are also experimenting with western architecture, so that also begins to happen. The other thing that begins to happen, and I did not have time to talk about this, but one of the things that is I've written in that edition of my introduction to Sangeen Beg's Sair Manazil also, is that they are trying to get hold of all these public properties. वक्फ, लावारिस, ये इस किस्म की जो कैटेगरीज हैं प्रॉपर्टी की, जिसके ऊपर traditionally it was the Mughal emperor who had control. So because now they are the de facto rulers, they are trying to gain control, and they start getting control of all these kind of, either they are common or properties which don't have clear titles and all. They are trying to gather them up and capture them. So that kind of impact is happening, but there's not that colonial city as a stamp of a colonial city comes after 1857.
you know, just to continue with that, you know, during the 19th century, under the colonial rulers, we have this concept of civil lines, which
Yeah.
starts coming up for the first time. We find it in Delhi. We find it, in, for example, at Aligarh, where I am sitting, like city coal, जो main शहर है. But parallel to that is a new city developing, which is known as civil lines. Uh, Now, civil lines at Aligarh, for example, has the university area, Dodhpur area, but still, जब यहाँ से हम लोग इस एरिया से उस एरिया जाते हैं तो कहते हैं कि हम शहर जा रहे
Exactly.
हैं, है ना? तो and Allahabad for that matter. I mean, you have entire development of a civil lines in you know, in Punjab. I mean, there is a society of urban studies which was formed by J.S. Grewal and Professor Indu Banga. Even their researches which they have done, they have also, and if I remember correctly, जो Frankenberg का volume है on Delhi, there is an article on the civil lines which started developing during the 19th century. I think we should also pay some attention कि कैसे एक मुगल सिटी से ही एक नया कंसेप्ट जहाँ एक घंटा घर, सिविल कोर्ट्स, और उस टाइप की अदर बिल्डिंग्स बन के कलकत्ते में भी फॉर एग्जांपल द सेम टाइप ऑफ डेवलपमेंट। तो ये मेरा रीजन था उसको पूछने का। बहरहाल, जो दूसरा मेरा और आखिरी सवाल है, रेस्ट एश्योर्ड इसके बाद नहीं पूछने जा रहा हूँ। आपकी तीन किताबें बहुत, एक तो वॉक पे है, आई मीन तीसरी छपने वाली है, लेकिन दो जो अब तक आई हैं आपकी किताबें, उसमें आपने एक तो आपने चांदनी चौक पे किया है और एक कैनॉट प्लेस पे किया है ना। आज जो आपने ये लेक्चर दिया, जो डिस्कशन किया, एक्चुअली अगर मैं इसे थोड़े दूसरे अल्फाज में कहूँ कि ये सफर जो था वो चांदनी चौक से कैनॉट प्लेस तक का था, है ना। तो ये आपने दोनों जगह जो चांदनी चौक, यू डिड ए सेपरेट वर्क ऑन चांदनी चौक, यू डिड separate work on Connaught Place. Uh, why you chose these two important places? What is the importance in the city planning of these two places, and how do they define the Mughal city and the colonial city?
I must confess that the names of the books were because these are a part of a series of books that is coming out. So the names were actually hooks. They were hooks to hang the story on. So Chandni Chowk is not just about Chandni Chowk; it's about Shahjahanabad. It's about the making of Shahjahanabad. And similarly, Connaught Place, the name is just the hook. It is Chandni Connaught Place and the making of New Delhi. So it's about the making of New Delhi. Um, to be very frank, a lot of that book, the two books, the reason was that because my PhD is on the 19th century, so this was not strictly my area at all. But what was happening was while I was working on that UNESCO dossier, I'd done a lot of background thinking about what is important about these two cities, New Delhi and Shahjahanabad, two imperial capitals, both built at a time when that particular respective imperial power was at its height of its glory. And they built this in the same site in Delhi. And how these two, how one references the other, what is the connection, etc. So I had done a lot of thinking about this, and I thought, let us write a book, just a small, short introduction to each of these and how they came to be. So that was really the reason behind writing these two books.
Well, thank you very much. This is the annotated translation, Mirza Sangeen Beg, Sairul Manazil. And I would request each and every one of you to please go through this work. It's a remarkable, source for Delhi as far as history of Delhi is concerned. It is one of the most remarkable works. Just like Sir Saeed Ahmad Khan's Asarus Sanadid, और 19th सेंचुरी में मौलवी बशीर अहमद की जो 3 वॉल्यूम में किताब है ऑन दिल्ली 19th century Delhi. These are some of the very important works which any student who wants to study about Delhi should take them up. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आपका. Ajay Mathur ji has pointed out that a similar work or similar thing should also be taken up as far as Lucknow is concerned. The whole development of the city of Lucknow was also during the 19th century. रुकैया जी दक्कन पहुंच जाएंगे तो पूरा बिल्कुल अलग हो जाएगा, बिल्कुल वहाँ की अलग चीज़ें हैं, वो गोलकुंडा और बीजापुर से इंस्पायर्ड है. That's a totally different area. But yes, colonial Lucknow, Awadh के region में a special study of comparison between Tughlaqabad and Shahjahanabad, and of course जो एक आध पैरेलल सिटीज़ हैं शाहजहानाबाद के कमोबेश the Mughal cities, इनके ऊपर I think the type of work which should have been done is still awaited. And along with Dr. Swapna Liddle, I would also request the viewers, if any of them are interested to take up these important and interesting research topics, you are. And before I end this session, I'll just remind all of you of a very good work, which although is not 19th century, it's neither the traditional Mughal period, दोनों के बीच का है, 1740s का, the account of दरगाह कुली खान, मुरक्का दिल्ली,
Yeah.
जो ब्रिज कर देता है मुगल दिल्ली को विद 19th सेंचुरी दिल्ली, जिसके बारे में स्वप्ना जी ने काम किया है. मुरक्का दिल्ली has been translated into Urdu, it has been translated into English, it's easily available, and it's a very beautifully written, vibrant account of the city of Delhi. कौन कौन से फेस्टिवल्स बनाए जा रहे हैं, क्या क्या हो रहा है, वहाँ शहरों पे गलियों में क्या हो रहा है, अब जब कोई किसी का अगर उर्स हो रहा है तो कैसे लोग जमा हो रहे हैं, फेस्टिवल्स कौन से हो रहे हैं, कौन कौन से कव्वाल है, कौन कौन से म्यूजिशियंस हैं, कौन कौन से तबला अच्छा बजाने वाले हैं. आई मीन जस्ट go through that account and you start getting information about a very culturally viable Delhi at a time when Delhi is not at its political zenith, at a time when Delhi is getting destroyed at the verge कि अब मुगल दिल्ली से अब ये कन्वर्ट हो जाएगा into something else. उस पीरियड का ये दौर है. अगर सो आई वुड आई मीन विश कि इसके ऊपर भी कभी कोई डिस्कशन हो. इसको भी काफ़ी लोगों ने पढ़ा है, देखा है, लेकिन आई थिंक दैट इज़ ऑल्सो समथिंग दैट वी शुड नेवर फॉरगेट and take into account. It was, I think, as far as I am concerned, it was an enlightening talk, and I really thank you for having joined us. And I wish that in future also you will cooperate and would be ready to speak on some other topic related with Delhi itself. With those words, I once again thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good night. And thank you all to all the listeners also.